Mikulski. I'm a research scientist at U.S. Army Tank Automotive Research Development and Engineering Center in Warren, Michigan, also known as TARDEC. And this is actually my first GrrCON. And so far, I've really liked this conference a lot. I have to say, I met a lot of great people here. And I really have to kind of give it up to Jamie and Chris. They are really, really generous to this community. And I just want to publicly give them my gratitude for allowing me to talk today. Basically, at TARDEC, I work in the ground vehicle robotics group. And I do research in computational trust. So essentially what I try to do is I try to teach robots how to trust other robots or people in group teaming scenarios, and then using that trust to affect the control, their behavior, so that they can do smart stuff to complete missions. And my application focus has been autonomous convoy operations. It's a really cool research problem because it's somewhat constrained and well-defined, but it's also really relevant for the military, for the Army in particular, because of the threat when during convoy operations over in theater. Basically, the #1 killer of our warfighters is IEDs, improvised explosive devices, or roadside bombs, and those typically blow up during convoy missions. So the idea of building vehicles that can drive themselves without anybody in it, statistically speaking, you reduce the number of people you need to do convoy missions, you'll probably reduce the casualty rate, thereby saving lives. So, but the whole thing is when you start putting technology into vehicles that allow them to drive themselves, you're also introducing new vulnerabilities. So about a year or so ago, I got introduced to the wonderful world of car hacking. I was at an event in Troy, Michigan, another suburb of Detroit. And basically, I got really excited about it. It was a 5-day event. Got excited about it. I wanted to go back to TARDEC afterwards and do this kind of stuff on our military systems. And I was trying to find a group at TARDEC that did this kind of stuff, and it turned out that we don't have anybody at TARDEC that does vulnerability assessments on military vehicles. That's not to say that the Army doesn't have anybody. I mean, the Army has a lot of qualified people doing this kind of stuff elsewhere, but for TARDEC being an R&D organization, you would think that there would be somebody there, but it turns out there wasn't. So that surprised me, but it also I kind of looked at it as an opportunity for myself. I said, hey, maybe I could be the guy to fill this gap. So I started talking with some colleagues of mine that were like-minded, and we started meeting kind of ad hoc, talking about this subject. Eventually, these meetings got more regular, and then more people started becoming invited to these meetings. And then over time, we kind of came to the conclusion that, as a group, we really couldn't affect as much change. We had to open up our group wider and try to develop a community. So we decided to open up the group to other people at TARDEC. And we had a really positive response. We had people from all over the organization, technical groups and non-technical groups like our HR and our external business office, for example. They were connecting with all of us and talking to all of us. And I can kind of say now, about a year later, we actually have a nice vehicle cybersecurity collaborative community at TARDEC, and that's something we've never had before. So that's really positive. But when we opened up this whole group to others, there were some challenges because we had some culture clashes. And that was something that I didn't really anticipate. When it happened, I just thought people were being assholes, but really what happened is they actually saw things differently than other people from other places, and didn't quite get a good appreciation for that until you really started talking with them and getting to know them. So that's kind of that was sort of the inspiration for this talk. I'm not really going to talk about TARDEC specifically anymore. This talk is more about the military cyber culture in general, and I just want to kind of talk about it, hopefully give a better understanding of this type of culture to this community, talk about how it struggles within the cyber domain, and maybe what are some ideas that it can learn from the hacker culture to improve its own culture. So let's start off with just a definition of what culture is. If you look on the internet, you'll probably find about 36 different definitions for culture. I found this one that probably works well enough for our purposes. It's from a guy named Edgar Sheen. He's a former MIT professor who's famous for his work in developmental, organizational development, and he defines culture as a pattern of shared basic assumptions that the group has learned. The group learned as it solved problems of external adaptation and internal integration that has worked well enough to be considered valid and therefore to be taught to new members as the correct way to perceive, think, and feel in relation to those problems. So the key ideas are pattern of shared basic assumptions that are good enough and considered to be the correct way to perceive, think, and feel. So when you apply this definition to military culture, certain characteristics emerge. Uniformity is a characteristic of military culture. The idea that really nobody's special, everybody is kind of the same, interchangeable. It also kind of speaks to aspects of the bond between military members, whether you're fighting on the front lines or supporting the logistics tail. You're all war fighters. You're all veterans. You're all heroes. That kind of idea gets embodied into the uniformity characteristic. Hard work. Yeah, this is basically begins being ingrained when a recruit goes to basic training. It doesn't matter if you're given a task that's considered to be impossible. The culture expects that you're going to do whatever you can do to complete that task, no matter how hard it is. Teamwork, really important, particularly for coordinated operations. You have to be able to rely on other people, and other people have to be able to rely on you. So the culture definitely supports that. Stoicism, the idea that it doesn't matter how much pain you're in, doesn't matter how much you're suffering, how much you're hurting, how much you don't like something. You keep it to yourself. You don't really tell anybody. Obviously, that has problems with it when you're considering things like PTSD. But it's still kind of an aspect of the culture that has sort of evolved over time. Orderliness, you got to find. Obviously, you got to have. The military has very rigid rules, regulations, processes. Things have to be on schedule, timely. Orderliness is a really big part of the culture, and also trust and authority. If somebody above you, ranking above you, gives you a command, an order to do, you have to follow it. It's just expected. So this culture evolved basically because of the types of operations that the military would be involved in different physical domains, land, air, and sea. And this chart kind of is supposed to depict all the different kinds of physical domains of warfare along the axis of the level of technology involved in the different spectrum of conflict. So traditionally, what you find is that the United States has generally dominated in the center part of this spectrum, traditional modern warfare and remote warfare. So what that's caused our adversaries to do is kind of move towards the poles of this spectrum. So you'll see, our adversaries either going for asymmetrical warfare through insurgencies or developing nuclear weapons. And, but the whole common thread behind this spectrum of conflict is that the cyber domain cuts across all of it. And it doesn't matter whether you're dealing with low-tech or high-tech, the cyber domain exists. And the military culture that has sort of evolved to deal with the physical domains hasn't really changed enough to change enough to be successful within the cyber domain. The cyber domain is a completely different beast than the physical domains of air, ground, and sea. Traditionally, the military has been basically dealing on the assumption that nation states only attack other nation states. Very well defined boundaries of who you are attacking, where they are, that kind of thing. But in our existing paradigm, particularly in the cyber domain, attacks and spying can occur between any combination of states, state proxies, non-state actors, and commercial companies. And sometimes you don't even know whether these attacks are offensive or defensive. The barriers are low, it's cheap, somewhat easy, and it can be pretty powerful. You can potentially have a global impact with the different kinds of cyber attacks that can happen in military context. So that's kind of what the existing paradigm looks like. What about where things are going? The way I kind of like to look at where things are going is I like to look at it in terms of 4 vectors kind of moving in the same direction but at different speeds. You've got technology that's moving the fastest, and right behind technology you've got the social norms. And then there's a big gap in speed between law and policy formation. And when you look at these 4 vectors, what can we extract? What kind of trends can we extract from these vectors? Well, when you look at the fastest two, you tend to see that we're, in general, trading privacy for convenience. And this has been a trend that has existed ever since the invention of the telegraph. This isn't anything new, and we can continue to see this kind of thing persist. And then on the slower side, you tend to be seeing this intention of trading privacy for security. Now, that's obviously kind of a controversial topic area, and it could probably be a talk in of its own. I'd really enjoy hearing a lawyer talk about this kind of stuff. But when you look at legislation like CISA and where they're going to be trying to basically allowing private companies to share information with the government and not have liability, and even looking at existing laws, even like the CFAA and DMCA, some reforms to those for white hackers to be protected from hacking into different systems and not having to go to jail. You I'm tending to see kind of a trend for trading privacy for security. But the main point that I wanted everybody to get out of this slide is that 3 of these 4 vectors are related to people, to humans, in particular human behavior. And as a result, a case can be made that the management of the different cyber challenges that we'll be facing are largely cultural, not necessarily technical. So kind of bring it down from sort of a 50,000 hive view down to more of an organizational level. What kind of benefits would you see from a better cyber culture in an organization? In general, what you'll see is better behaviors. In general, less risky behaviors, maybe more compliance with IA policies, decreased resistance to changes. But I know there are probably plenty of folks out there that are looking at this and saying, well, better will never be perfect. It only takes one to compromise a system. Why bother? Why should we even bother dealing with the culture? Well, I think an argument can be made that better culture will probably reduce the ease of exploiting vulnerabilities. It's not going to get rid of them, but it'll probably reduce the ease of it. You might also have fewer network anomalies, so maybe you can have better detection when you're looking for intrusions. And if you're implementing...
Sorry folks, video glitch here, but audio will resume shortly.
That's a tough thing to deal with. It's a really difficult thing to deal with. And some of the problems that it's caused is, for example, it's caused us to have an outdated procurement system. Our networks are not viewed as war-fighting platforms. Basically, if someone wants a network, they call an IT guy to build the network. But the IT guy doesn't really have concept of how it's going to be used in an operational context. So the acquisition of the networks and the operations of the networks don't intertwine. So that's a problem. So what that results in is that you end up with little situational awareness of what's going on in the networks when you're using them in an operational context. You don't typically know what the intrusions are until after they happen, and the soldiers using these networks really can't anticipate what adversaries might do. And it's a lot different than what they're used to. Like if they had boots on the ground and they were looking around in a physical environment, they could say, hey, I see mountains over there, I see trees over there, I see that there's an area over here that the enemy may be able to come in, so I better set up my defenses over there. They can't do that kind of analogous thing within their networks. And that's a real issue sometimes. But even if, say, there was some way where we could fix the procurement system and have much better situational awareness on the networks, we still run into another issue about sharing between different branches. In many cases, different branches can't share because of clearance issues. If somebody discovers a threat and it's classified as top secret, they can't necessarily easily tell somebody of a lower classification about that threat. It's those are the rules. You can't do it. So now all these different problems, these aren't new problems. They're not. It's not as if the Department of Defense doesn't know about them. And then there are lots of people working on resolving these issues. But the question I want to ask is, what is the military doing with regards to addressing the cultural stuff? So one of the big things I heard about this year at the NSA conference was cyber hygiene. Has anybody heard about this stuff? It's basically, it's a lot of us probably consider it as common sense, but the military is promoting it in terms of people having good passwords, not clicking links in your email, not plugging devices into your computers. It's a lot of common sense stuff. But just like the military, sometimes they take it a little bit too far. And, for example, like a password policy, just last week I was connecting to a government website, and it asked me to create a password that's 15 characters long, 2 capital letters, 2 lowercase letters, 2 numbers, 2 special characters. It's kind of defeating, it sounds secure, because you're adding all this random stuff in it, but really, you know what? If I'm going to have to access this site, I'm not going to remember such a long password. I'm probably going to have to write it down somewhere, and it's kind of defeating the whole purpose of better passwords. So, the cyber hygiene thing, while it's a really good idea probably to spread across the entire military, sometimes the implementation of it, the policies that come out of it aren't always the best. And then the other thing, we can look into is the actual DoD cyber strategy, which was updated in April of this year. And if you and it's not a very long document, but if you kind of scan through it, there really isn't a whole lot in there about affecting the culture. But there are a couple things that we can kind of point out. Firstly, the big thing I noticed was integrating cyber into mission assurance assessments. Now, mission assurance, it's all about full lifecycle engineering processes that are designed to deal with deficiencies in mission success. And in the past, the cyber domain was never integrated into these mission assurance assessments. Going forward, this is going to be different. And because the mission always comes first, I think this is going to have a really big impact culturally on the entire military. The other thing that they talk about in the strategy is mitigating the risk of insider threats. Now, they talk about it in terms of intrusion detection systems and more technical stuff, but then they have this little footnote talking about a requirement for a culture of awareness. And this is really the only time the DoD cyber strategy mentions culture specifically. So, I imagine the strategy is going to get updated in the future. I would hope maybe in the future they would consider more of the cultural aspects when designing their strategy in the future. The thing that I ask is, can we do better? And is there anything that we can learn from the hacker culture and be able to adopt into the military culture? So just kind of doing a side-by-side comparison between hacker culture and military culture, and I'm looking at hacker culture more broadly than just computer hacker. You know, we can see that military culture values uniformity. Hacker culture is all about uniqueness, individualism. Military culture, hard work. Hacker culture, it's more about, I think, playfulness. Military culture is about teamwork. Hacker culture is about a little softer, more cooperative, more collaborative. Stoicism for military culture, keeping things in, holding things in, not sharing what you really think. I think hacker culture tends to be more about sharing and being more open. Military culture, being very orderly, rule-oriented. Hacker culture is more about creativeness, going in any direction, no bounds. And finally, trust and authority. Well, it's completely opposite in hacker culture. It's generally a distrust in authority. So on the surface, it kind of looks like these two cultures are incompatible with each other. And maybe they are. That's not to say that the military doesn't adapt elements from the hacker culture for specific functions, say DARPA, like when they relate to the Cyber Grand Challenge or working on formal methods research through the HACMS program, or even the NSA, you know, doing information intelligence work. You know, they'll adapt things from the hacker culture in those specific functions. And the same thing, the hackers will adapt things from military culture if they want to do things on any kind of large scale, whether with people or botnets. Actually, if you look at the botnet from a cultural perspective, it kind of ticks all the boxes on the military culture side. But the question I want to ask is, are there any, even despite these incompatibilities, is there anything that we can do, are there any ideas that we can adopt from the hacker culture into the military culture more holistically? I think there are. I think one idea we can adapt into the military is being more curious. Creating a culture where it's okay to ask more what-if questions. Creating a culture where people are encouraged to actively listen, not just listen, okay, what is the task I have to do? No, try to listen actually with understanding. In a culture where people will notice or more aware of what others are doing around them. I think being more curious is something that hackers, it's just something naturally that they do. I don't think this is necessarily something that's naturally ingrained within the military culture. And then speaking up. Hacker culture, they don't care. People don't care if they offend somebody or they criticize someone. And I would probably argue that a lot of military folks probably don't care either. This is probably more of a bullet for the civilian side. But they also don't worry about appearing weak or too sensitive or out of line. Really, I think within the hacker culture, the focus is about the greater good and making the greater good a priority. And I think having policies where military folks are encouraged to speak up is something that will be really important to deal with issues within the cyber domain. And then finally, making things more fun, maybe through gamification. Essentially, like in any game, you have to have good incentives, accountability, and enforcement. In general, the military has to have those kind of things ingrained in its culture. Obviously, though, you have to apply it in context of what you're doing. So like in my case, in an R&D organization, we can maybe try to make things more fun by pitting developers and engineers against pen testers and having sort of an internal kind of competition, who can do better. That's something that's a kind of a part of a culture that you can introduce that's positive, that will have a positive effect on cybersecurity. So, given this was only a this is pretty much my last slide, just a couple final thoughts. My hope is that you understand a little bit better why the military does what it does when it comes to the cyber domain. And maybe, hopefully, for some folks, maybe start to build some bridges. In order for the military to improve, it needs to make cybersecurity a more natural aspect of daily activities. So they need to see their cyber operatives as warfighters. They need to treat their military networks as warfighting platforms. And they need to treat the whole domain, the cyber domain, as something real, not something that's actually imaginary. And in addition, anyone that's working in or for the military needs to just consider being more open to change. This is kind of addressing that hidebound culture of sticking to tradition and convention. When with the cyber domain changing as quickly as it is, it's not something that is really compatible. So I would hope, this is kind of the big point, is people at all levels just be a little bit more open-minded, consider the threats, consider what you can do to respond to the threats, not just in the ways that you've always done it. And that's basically my talk, short and sweet. I'll be around for questions if anybody wants to have some conversations, but thank you very much.